All right. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone back to the brain injury discussion. This is your host, Jay. Today, we're going to talk about the very beginnings of brain injury, which date back over 2,000 years. And this should be a very interesting discussion, especially for you history nerds out there. I am one of them. So I don't know if that gives me the right to say it, but if you are into history and you are into brains, this is for you. And this is interesting stuff. And I think we can all agree that maybe if we're going to look for the future, we should look to the past. So, with that being said, like always, I'd appreciate if you give it a thumbs up, maybe recommend this video to a friend who's also into history, and leave a comment. Something new you learned, or maybe there's a topic you want us to cover, or maybe there's something interesting that maybe I didn't find. Again, sources will be in the description below, like usual, and we do appreciate subscriptions. But with that being said, um, for as few slides as this is, there's still a lot to cover. So let's get into this. We have to start with a historical example to really give us a good idea of what brain injury looked like a few thousand years ago. And the one I could really find was Alexander the Great. Now, for those who studied in history class, like I did, we know a little bit about his backstory, about his conquering nature. He was the ruler of Macedonia between these years, 356 BC to 323 BC. He was a warrior, he was a king, he had a very combative lifestyle. It was kind of his job during his entire life to go out and conquer other nations. Um, and these things ranged from his homeland in Macedonia all the way, which is now modern day Macedonia or Greece. Um, Now it spread all the way through Egypt, through what is now modern day Iraq, Iran, through Persia at the time, and even into the Indus Valley of what we call Pakistan and India. So, but with that being said, let's focus on the brain injury stuff. Now, because he was a warrior, he was a king, he was always at war, you could expect him in the fight. And fighting professions usually lead to brain injuries, like we've seen in multiple head trauma videos. So he's got a few possible causes of brain injury. He did not live a very long life, probably because he did not protect his brain. If we do the math, he wasn't even 40 when he died. But there are some brain injuries here that we could look at that we can retroactively or forensically look at some of the writings, at some of the documentation, and we could really get a grip on what kind of brain injuries he had. And he might have had a brain injury via alcohol abuse because it was described that he had what we now call um, delirium tremens, which is uh, shaking, some of those after effects. When someone is chronically abusing alcohol, they will have withdrawal symptoms and they can be extremely severe. Now, being a Greek in the 300s BC can definitely lead to that because wine was very popular and very common. So again, he could have been a victim of alcohol abuse because of the culture of the time as well as his lifestyle. Another writer noted to some abdominal pain, and they retroactively think it was pancreatitis with encephalopathy. So, the pancreas being important to the endocrine system. So, like the rest of the endocrine system, including the thyroid, all the glands. And they thought that maybe that was affecting his brain. And you might think, well, maybe he went to, a sugar low, kind of like a diabetic might. Again, they think he might have had some encephalopathy from some of the swelling that was going on in his body. So that's just something to think about, moving forward. There's plenty to think about. There's plenty to discuss here. Another possible brain injury he may have had would have been West Nile virus or maybe something akin to that because he was in fact in Egypt. He basically conquered Egypt at some point in his life, and West Nile virus as well as other mosquito-borne or vector-borne illnesses can transmit parasites, viruses, bacteria that can cause that inflammation and swelling in the brain. And West Nile virus can be one of those. And then this article down here, again, sources in the description below, purports that he might have had what we call CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which, you know, sometimes is previously called punch drunk. About a year, 100 years ago, they would have called it dementia pugilistica, punch drunk. They look at some of his actions and they see some overlap there with CTE, as well as his lifestyle being very combative, being in a lot of battles. And they think he might have had a lot of repeated head trauma, even with a helmet, because Greek soldiers would have been called hoplites. It would have been armored from head to basically knees. They would have had that, and even with the armor, even with brass armor, or what kind of metal the armor they had, it would not have stopped everything. And there's no doubt that Alexander the Great one himself, could have had a brain injury. But with that being said, I would not recommend going the same path he did unless you're going into the WWE. But think about it. That is a brain injury. That is a man with multiple or possibly very many brain injuries, or at least there's a lot of potential there. So, with that being said, what kind of people would have been taking care of him? Well, if we look at some of the earliest doctors, and I tended to gravitate to these three, Hippocrates and Celsus, who were, if I'm correct, both Greek. And then we have Galen, who was Roman times. These are some of the earliest pioneers in medicine, and they were really pioneers for brain injury. They started studying the body, but not just necessarily studying it, but recording what they found. And because the scientific method was being utilized at the time, they were writing things down, trying it, testing their hypothesis, coming to a conclusion. And specifically, these three were medical providers for sports, combat, and other kinds of trauma. And if you imagine, if you are a conqueror in Alexander the Great's army, you tended to probably be in a lot of fights, which could lead to a lot of physical blows to the head. Same thing goes with sports at the time, especially fighting sports, um, like the Olympics today. I mean, there was a lot of fighting sports back then. So sports and combat were probably the two major drivers of brain injury at the time, as well as probably workplace accidents, which I would say more ancient Egypt is a better place to study. But these were the three I gravitated to because they really documented what they saw. And that documenting was important to later on down the line. And it really established the cornerstone of brain injury. And they found there were primary things, okay, like who knows, this person was hit in the head while wrestling or while fighting. And they documented secondary things as well. And again, symptoms, that is something that one can describe but cannot measure. And signs is something that you can measure. A symptom is a headache. That could be a headache from a brain injury. A sign is someone's blood pressure being too high, causing the headache. Sign is the blood pressure, sign is the pulse, heart rate, breathing, oxygenation. Symptoms is something that you get described. But what they were really doing in these three, they were describing this, they were documenting it, not just for their own selves, but for posterity. And it leads us to something that we hear a lot in the modern day, and that's evidence-based medicine. Well, technically, the Romans and Greeks and the Egyptians were using evidence-based medicine too, so it's nothing new. They developed and tested therapeutics and therapies. And what I found really interesting is they were actually talking about music therapy in one of these articles. Wow, they're talking about music 3,000 years ago as a good therapy? And now we're coming into the realization that, yes, there was a lot of things that worked back then that we can use today. And music therapy is one of those things that it's not a new thing. It's 2, 3, 4,000 years old. And I think maybe we should study the past to see where we're going in the future. But with that being said, let's look at brain injury interventions and documentations that we know about. Again, we weren't there to do the forensics. We can't go back in time and look at Alexander the Great, and we can't go back in time to talk to Galen and Hippocrates. I wish we could. That would be interesting discussions. But we look at some of these things that were documenting these things. And they were really documenting skull fractures, especially depressed skull fractures, especially from combat sports, right? Talking about contusions and indentations. Again, those things do happen even today. And they really focus on the understanding, not just knowing, but the understanding of anatomy, which leads to the field of physiology. And those guys were the first ones to really pioneer what we would call neurosurgery. Something that would have happened would have been called trepanation, where they were drilling into the skull to relieve pressure on the brain to allow, for example, a subdural hematoma to release that extra pressure caused by fluid. Um, we call it a decompressive craniotomy, but it's basically the same thing, relieving pressure on the brain. Same thing with like shunts, except yes, our equipment is like sterile, it's modern. However, their equipment, which is seen in this photo right here, right? Let's take a look at that. We have a drill, we have other kinds of drills, we have things. The only big difference between the tools that they used and the tools we use in modern neurosurgery is that ours are powered by electricity. They actually had to use their physical muscles. So a lot of these were hand tools. Nowadays, we use the same basic ideas or the same basic tools, except ours are powered by electricity. Theirs are powered by hand. So keep that in mind next time you go see a neurosurgeon. They're basically using tools that are 3,000 years old. And if you look at the modern set of tools, I'm sure Galen, Hippocrates would recognize a few of those. So, what does this lead me as a brain injury case manager to conclude? Well, there are ancient medical techniques, and it is the foundation, the cornerstone of modern medicine. So if we start looking at the past, we might see where we're going in the future. We might see what were the building blocks that got us to where we are today. Even someone as powerful and as great as Alexander the Great could have had a brain injury. And who knows, he might have even died from it. And we do know that these early doctors and early medical observations are still relevant, especially with this thing that we have really been focused on as modern medicine has been focusing on is stuff like music therapy. They knew it back then. We're re-examining those things. And it's all because of the documentation and the really experimentation of people like this, people like Hippocrates. Because without them, we don't get uh, the cornerstone of really understanding the first starts. Yes, small steps, but people like Hippocrates took the time to document it, record it for posterity, and then they were able to pass that information on to the next generation and so on and so forth. And what we really get is a vast improvement. Um, and there are still things that are being done today, except tools are now, for the most part, electrified. They're powered by electricity instead of by hand. But um, when we look to the past, and we see the cornerstones and the foundations of what has become the metaphorical house of modern medicine, we're able to see the groundwork, the importance of observation, of documentation, and also innovation. Mainly, evidence-based medicine is not new. It is a few thousand years old, and medicine is a practice. There's always going to be an evolution and changes involved. So, but with that being said, that should conclude it for this presentation. Those are my resources. Um, like always, I'd appreciate thumbs ups on these videos as well as feel free to leave a comment, subscribe. We try to put out this content every week. And if you have a suggestion for a topic, maybe there's something I missed, drop it in the comment section. I'd love to hear it. Maybe it'd be a topic for a future video. And with that being said, I'd encourage you, especially if you're a history buff, feel free to read these sources. They're really interesting. But with that being said, I'm going to sign off here. You all have an excellent day, and don't forget to protect those brains.